So let's talk about the Lesson 9 discussion board posting. So, over the course of the last 4 weeks, we've been moving through the writing process. We started with guided brainstorming in lessons 5 and 6. We worked on writing the rough draft in parts in lessons 7 and 8. And now in lesson 9, we're moving towards editing and revising the paper for submission. So, we haven't talked a lot about grammar rules up until this point because I tend to find it more effective, and research shows that this is true, that students learn grammar rules better in the context of writing rather than isolation in kill and drill worksheets and quizzes. And so, we are going to talk about some strategies for revising both this paper, the rhetorical listening assignment, as well as your This I Believe essay from Unit 1. It's kind of, I use the analogy of tennis a lot. It's a lot like playing tennis. That, it's helpful to study the rules of tennis, right? But it doesn't make you necessarily a better tennis player until you get out there and actually start playing. And so that's why I tend to put the grammar rules after you've written the paper so that you can circle back and start working on some of those in the context of your writing. So let's revisit your This I Believe essay and your rhetorical listening rough draft. So pick one of those assignments for this discussion board posting. I want you to think about places or moments in either of those assignments in which I gave comments, and I want you to think about which ones might have been especially effective. I want you to think about comments that maybe you disagreed with. Now, I will say, for example, thinking about revising the This I Believe essay, a couple of the comments that I made, there were two. One was narrative coherence, that it didn't feel like I was moving through the essay in a fluid kind of start to finish. Instead, it felt like introduction, point one, point two, point three, conclusion. And that's really not what the personal essay does. There needs to be some narrative cohesiveness and organizational coherence that moves me through the text. So that's one of the things that you want to go back and look at. The other comment that I made primarily in regard to the rhetorical or in regard to the This I Believe essay was in regard to tone. Now, while that is a personal essay and you are writing about your own experiences, it's still written for an academic audience. The context, the audience dictates what we write. And so if you were writing an email or in a journal about this experience, then you can have a level of informality that's appropriate, right? Maybe the email is directed to a friend, or maybe you're writing a note to a parent. Maybe you are writing something that allows for a bit more informality. But for this assignment, your This I Believe essay, you're writing for an academic audience of your peers. You're writing for your colleagues at NCTC, your instructors. And so there's an expectation of a certain level of formality. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you can't use, say, I in your This I Believe essay, right? Because it is still about you and your experiences, but it also requires that you work maybe a little bit harder to keep up a bit more formality between you and the reader so that it doesn't kind of swing into journal writing, because that's not what this is. Um, Also, there are times when it is appropriate to use I or you. Personal essays, it's appropriate to use I. It's probably not appropriate to use you, right? Because really a you kind of points the finger back at the reader, and a personal essay is inviting you to point the finger at yourself. But there are times when a you is appropriate, right? If you're writing an editorial, a letter to an editor, if you're writing directions, you is entirely appropriate in those cases. And so you want to start thinking about grammar not as a prescribed set of rules that you can or can't or must do, but think about it more rhetorically. Think about it as a series of choices that you're making that are considering the audience and the purpose, the context in which you're writing. So, for example, if you are writing a paper for a science class, I and you is typically not appropriate. Third person objective is much more appropriate and expected in a science paper, because the research should speak for itself. If you're writing a paper in a literature course, that kind of telegraphing in this paper I will discuss is typically not expected in a literature paper. There's a bit more nuance, kind of unpacking and letting the reader draw their own conclusions about the argument that's expected in a literature paper. But if you're writing a personal essay, right, then I is entirely appropriate. So you want to start thinking about grammar rhetorically rather than always just prescriptively. Because there are times, for example, I use in the discussion board posting here that, students often say, well, you can't start a sentence with and or but. And if you'll notice in my discussions in the emails that I send out, my announcements, I often start a sentence with and or but. Now, it's a complete sentence on the other side of that coordinating conjunction, but I like to start sentences with and, comma, and then the sentence, because it tends to evoke a bit more informality and conversational tone that I'm trying to impart in my writing, because I'm typically writing for students who might be nervous or reticent to share their writing with me. They might have had bad experiences with writing for other instructors or in other contexts. And so they're already nervous. And so I use and or but intentionally at the beginning of sentences so that it kind of reads a bit more conversational. It reads a bit softer. And that's what I'm trying to do. And so my choice is grammatically sound because it's a complete sentence, but it's also rhetorically sound because I'm making that decision to convey a specific type of tone. So you want to start thinking about some of those choices that you're making in your grammar and mechanics. You also want to, for this assignment, after you've revisited your This I Believe essay or your rhetorical listening rough draft, you want to identify a paragraph or a passage and copy and paste it into the discussion forum and begin revising it. So hopefully now that you've gone back and looked at your This I Believe essay, you see some of those comments that I made because you've taken a moment, you've kind of gotten some distance and perspective from that assignment. So take a moment to look at that. Look at places for some of those grammar rules that you want to make sure are accurate. Maybe fragments, run-on sentences, comma splices, apostrophes, subject-verb agreement, pronoun reference agreement errors, combining sentences, kind of the language. I put computers there. But you want to think about some of those, kind of grammatical rules. And if you broke them in the paper, is there a reason why? And thinking about your audience, if it's not appropriate in this case to have a fragment or a run-on sentence, then you want to work to revise that. Because just like I said, while grammar can be rhetorical and you can make choices and you have to think about your audience, sometimes the audience expects a certain level of grammatical polish that you have to deliver. And so, if your paper is, has a lot of fragments, then your instructor might not necessarily, kind of get to the point and is able to see the argument that you're making and the nuances of that argument because they're too distracted by the fragments. And so that means that, while, sometimes you may deliberately break the rules, you also sometimes have to be deliberate about following them so that it doesn't distract from your message. So that's what we're doing for this. Identify a passage from one of your papers and then revise that passage based on the suggestions for grammatical rules in the editing chapter from the hub. Then you want to copy and paste that paragraph into the discussion forum. And I would encourage you to copy it and paste it back into your original. So that way, if you revise it and resubmit it, you already have one paragraph that you've worked on. And then you want to comment on 2 of your classmates' postings. Do you think their revisions are helpful? Do you see other areas for improvement? A lot of times, when I'm revising something, I see it much easier in somebody else's writing than I see it in my own, because I'm kind of projecting what I think the text says, because that's how I see it in my head. Whereas, my classmate or my colleague is actually able to see only what's on the page. And so sometimes it's really helpful to have second set of eyes look at your paper or your paragraph. So that's what you're doing for your classmates. So just like in previous assignments, this is a completion grade. And so 100 means that you did an original post plus 2 replies. A 66 means either maybe you have one original post and one reply, and a 33 means perhaps you only have one original reply. If you have any questions about this assignment, feel free to shoot me an email.